Good morning. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative meeting to discuss the revised trial proposal, which was posted on January 25th. My name is Elisandra Casillas, representing the Stakeholder Engagement Group here at the ISO, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. And I will also be joined by Danielle Tavel from Policy Development. This presentation and other materials related to this can be found on the initiative webpage. And just some housekeeping reminders, this call is being recorded and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. So please keep comments professional and respectful. Also, please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage time efficiently. And instructions for raising hands. We will pause for questions periodically throughout the meeting. You can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx. Or if you've joined via audio only, press #2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first. And if you need any technical assistance during today's meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. And again, please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comments. You may also send your question via chat to all panelists. Next slide, please. This graphic depicts the ISO stakeholder process. We are currently in the straw proposal development phase of the stakeholder process, and I'll review the next steps in the process at the end of this presentation. Next slide. For today's agenda, after I'm finished with the welcome introduction and stakeholder process, I'll turn it over to Danielle Tavel, who will discuss the background in addition to phase 1 process enhancements and other residual issues, followed by a lunch break from 12 to 1 p.m. When we return, we will discuss the other stakeholder suggested issues, and we will close out this meeting with the next step. Next slide. And from here, I will turn it over to Danielle.
Great, thanks, Ellie. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and consideration. So the next few slides are going to serve as a high-level introduction to the IPE initiative. They might seem a little bit repetitive for those that have been following along, but I like to do this at the onset of every call just to make sure everyone's on the same page. And then we'll get into more details related to the issues outlined in the revised straw proposal. Let's move to the next slide. Great. So the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative, or IPE, is the ISO's ongoing commitment to continuous improvement to the generator interconnection and deliverability allocation procedures, or GITAP. And we do this by making appropriate process enhancements as the environment for resource interconnection evolves. This 2021 IPE initiative is really seeking to explore solutions to issues that fall into 3 main buckets. The first bucket is addressing the fact that we need to meet the challenges facing timely, effective, reliable, and economic resource and transmission development over the next decade. And this really relies on improving coordination across all fronts related to transmission and resource planning occurring at the ISO and state agencies. The second bucket is focused on resolving issues and creating enhancements to handle the accelerated pace of resource procurement and development needed over the next 5 to 10 years that may not align with our current interconnection processes. And finally, the third bucket is focused on issues that we're aware of and need to be enhanced or adjusted based on current circumstances since the last IPE initiative that was conducted back in 2018. And before we move on to the next slide, I think it's also really important here to note that we don't want to address any of these issues in isolation. We think all of these issues need to be addressed in coordination with each other in order to achieve a sustainable approach to resolving these issues. Next slide.
Hi, Danielle. Looks like we have one question in the queue.
Let me go ahead and get through the next 2 slides, and then I'll pause for questions, and we can take Susan's So given the current supply conditions and unprecedented procurement orders for the next 5 years, we've determined that this initiative will have two distinct but simultaneously run phases. Phase 1 is going to focus on those near-term enhancements to the existing interconnection processes that the ISO can resolve, particularly related to the queue overload compounded by cluster 14. This phase is targeting a completion before summer 2022 and a May Board of Governors approval date. Phase 2 is going to focus on resolving the longer-term modifications and broader reforms to align interconnection processes with procurement activities. And these modifications and process reform considerations will really work to achieve greater efficiencies and use of valuable planning and engineering expertise, while also reducing uncertainty in the development processes. This phase is targeting a completion before the start of cluster 15 process that happens in April of 2023, and that phase is targeting a Board of Governors approval in November of 2022. Next slide, please. The primary focus of the revised straw proposal that was posted last week and today's stakeholder call is on Phase 1 near-term enhancements. And these, like I mentioned, are focused on items that we can resolve for cluster 14 and before the summer of 2022. These proposals that we're going to talk mainly about today are largely focused on process enhancements. And as you'll see from the presenters, that a lot of the stakeholder comments were in support of the proposals previously presented, so the proposals have largely remained unchanged. As I mentioned previously, the other piece of the initiative is focused on Phase 2 issues, but to make sure that we keep the Phase 1 proposal development on track, we're proposing to defer proposal development for those Phase 2 items until the next iteration of the policy proposal. Likewise, there are a few additional items requiring state agency coordination that we're proposing to be addressed outside of the IPE process altogether to allow for greater stakeholder discussion and promote further collaboration on those topics. So I'll pause here before handing it over to Linda to see if there's any questions or comments.
All right, so looks like we do have a couple callers in queue. Moving on to our first one. Caller, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Good morning.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a quick question about Phase 2. So it seems like we're going to defer those. I understand what you're saying there, and it makes sense in terms of priorities. But when you return, well, either when you return to Phase 2 or even sort of as additional comments based on what's in the straw proposal, the revised straw proposal, is it okay for people to offer additional thoughts for the CAISO? And when you return, is there going to be some flexibility on the scope, or is the scope pretty much defined as you have it today? Or what are your thoughts about Phase 2 and what happens between now and what is, I think, going to be a draft final proposal in June or something like that?
Yep, yeah, you're exactly correct, Susan. Our intent is to post the draft final proposal for Phase 2 in June, and I would say the scope is pretty set for Phase 2. However, we do welcome feedback and any further ideas from stakeholders on those Phase 2 topics anytime before June. We'll definitely consider those.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, this is Carolina Masanka from the CPUC. Very similar question. So I just wanted to clarify, when you said deferred until next iteration, you were referring to June and not, for example, the next iteration in March. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And there's a slide at the very end of this presentation that outlines the schedule for both Phase 1 and Phase 2 going forward. And I think, based on some of the comments I made earlier, our intent right now is to really prioritize those phase one proposals because we are targeting a May Board of Governors date. But like I mentioned to Susan, we will take comments and consider feedback on phase two going forward until the June proposal comes out.
Okay, that's helpful. And in this revised draw proposal, in some sections, it's a little unclear if the proposals are for phase one or phase two. So it would be good to maybe just make that more clear in the next round. And there are some references to sub-working groups, which I think refer to phase two. Maybe you'll speak to that later, but just wanted to get a sense of whether references to any working groups in the future are generally referring to June and beyond that.
Yeah, I'll clarify a couple of those points for you. At the very end of this presentation, we've included a couple slides in the appendix that outline exactly which issues are in phase one and which are in phase two. And going forward, we will make that more clear for stakeholders, but hopefully that helps. And then with respect to the stakeholder workshops, you'll hear from the rest of my team today on our intent for those, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some clarification once we get to those slides.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, and then moving on to our next caller. And caller, go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Danielle. This is Arash Abatyan from EDF Renewables. Just trying to better understand, as you pointed out, the timeline for your proposed phase one and phase two. So if phase two is going to Board of Governors in November 2022 for, I assume, the final approval, when does CAISO plan on going through, I guess, or implementation timeline? So when does that get implemented?
Sure. So for phase two, we're targeting an implementation before the start of cluster 15, which would happen in April of 2023.
Okay, and I guess what I'm trying to understand is just based on the magnitude of backlogs, and I'm looking at across the country, and based on recent examples that we've seen in MISO, SPP, PJM, and the recent approval of SPPQ, I mean, would it make sense to expedite phase two a bit more? I mean, it just seems like we got to wait over another year before the implementation goes into effect, and we're still dealing with backlog under the current queue.
Sure, and I think that's a good point, and I'll let others on my team jump in here, but I think, the majority of the phase one topics that we're going to be talking about today, I think, get to those process enhancements that will help with the queue overload problem. And we wanted to prioritize those for an earlier implementation because we recognize that it is an issue that we're facing today and it shouldn't be delayed. I think those phase two issues really speak to the longer term, broader process reforms that do need a bit more time with stakeholder development to make sure that we're achieving the result that we're aiming for.
Sure, and I guess as a follow-up, how is CAISO comparing, I guess, their current process improvement or queue reforms, I should say, in compared to what's happening in the other parts of country? I mean, there are some drastic changes taking place in other markets, call it major queue reforms. Has there been any consideration?
Yes, I mean, I think we're taking a look consistently at what other ISOs are doing. And specifically for those phase two items, I think we're really paying attention to recent developments that FERC has been vocal on to help inform those policies.
Great, thank you much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
It looks like we do not have any more callers in queue.
Great. So I think we can turn it over to Linda Wright, who's going to kick us off with the Phase 1 process enhancements.
Good morning, everybody. This is Linda Wright, Lead Interconnection Specialist in the Interconnection Resources Group. Do you advance the slide, please? One more. Thank you. So first item is regarding removing the downsizing window and simplifying the downsizing request requirements. The proposed changes to this have received strong support from the stakeholders, so the proposal remains unchanged. This item will remove the downsizing window that currently exists, and projects will be able to submit a downsizing request at any time via the MMA process. There was concern voiced regarding the impact of the MMA process. So historically, there have been very few or even no requests of this type submitted during the downsizing window, so the impact to the MMA process is expected to be minimal at best. Impacts to downsize projects with network upgrades will be determined in the next annual reassessment study process. And projects with no network upgrades will be able to have their GIAs amended without any further study. Are there any questions about this proposal?
All right, looks like we do have a caller in queue. And caller, go ahead.
No. Hi, Linda. This is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I think last time we talked about this, there was potentially some leeway where even if a project had network upgrades, that there may be some, if it was a fairly easy determination, for example, if the network upgrades were assigned 100% to the project or some similar thing like that, that perhaps that might be able to be handled through the MMA process. Is that still part of your thoughts here?
That would have to be determined on a case-by-case basis.
Right. Yeah, but still there would be a possibility of a case-by-case assessment of that potentially through the MMA process?
Theoretically, that could possibly happen.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have no more callers.
All right, thank you. Next slide. This is for Bob.
All right, thank you, Linda. So I'm Bob Emmert, Senior Manager of Interconnection Resources. So this topic is related to transmission plan deliverability, the process modifications for allocations. And the proposal is, this is going to be a fairly meaty item, so I'm going to go through this slide and have some additional discussions, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I'll just start off by going through the slide what the actual proposal is at this point, where the ISO is continuing to propose that we are going to eliminate allocation group 3, and then we're going to collapse the remaining 6 allocation groups into 3 allocation groups, where group 1 is where basically any project that has a TPA, either active or in operation, that requires full capacity delivery status, or where the interconnection customer is an LSE serving its own load, would qualify for group 1 allocation. Group 2 is where any project that currently is shortlisted or actively negotiating a TPA would qualify for group 2 allocations. And then group 3 is where any project that has achieved commercial operation can then be in that third group for allocation. And then a clarification for the proposal that this didn't get in the proposal, but it was the intent, and want to make sure this is clear, that projects must have completed all studies to be eligible for either groups 1, 2, or 3. And where this, probably the biggest impact on this is there was a question related to ISP, independent study projects, that might want to seek an allocation after they've received their reliability study reports, but have not completed their deliverability study reports. And the ISO believes it's appropriate for the ISPs to be able to finish all of their studies along with the cluster group that they're being studied for deliverability with, so that there wouldn't be any opportunity to basically jump ahead of those projects that they're being studied with for deliverability. We will be revising the BPM items related to the scoring mechanisms. All of the scoring process and scores are in the BPM, and we'll be updating that, and we'll be looking to provide additional categories for scoring so that we can have greater differentiation between the projects within an allocation group for ranking. Now that we're including more projects that are eligible for group 1 and more projects that would be eligible for group 2, we need to have more ways to score and differentiate between projects to make sure that we can develop an order of allocation within each of these groups, and also to help us to eliminate or reduce the chances of ties, where at the end, if you run out of an amount to allocate to everybody that's eligible, but you have a number of projects that are next in line that are tied with scores, we end up giving a prorater across those remaining projects, and we don't think that's really the best way of doing it. So if we can get some more differentiation and reduce ties, we think that would be beneficial as well. We further clarified the requirement related to the PPA requiring deliverability, where a PPA must be an off-taker to fulfill its own RA obligations. So that is something that we continue to believe is something that has always been a process within, or a tenet of the GitApp allocation process, and we think that's worth maintaining. And we eliminated all TPD retention criteria except for those that are related to projects that receive an allocation in group 2. And basically, there still is a requirement for group 2 for those projects that are negotiating a PPA, that they must have their PPA executed by the time the next allocation cycle rolls around. We did remove the date that the allocation, or excuse me, the PPA would have to be executed by November 30th, and we did make it to where it would have to be executed by the date that the retention affidavits would be due. And the due date for these affidavits, both for seeking and for retention, is not in the tariff. It's something that we can, just by market notice, provide what the due date of those are at. So that gives us a little bit of flexibility to wait a little bit longer if we feel it's appropriate to request those seeking affidavits. And we feel that this process will relieve the administrative burden both on ISO and on the customers as well. So I wanted to go back and speak a little bit more about allocation group 3. A number of stakeholders did provide suggestions that they thought we should keep allocation group 3, although modifying it somewhat. And we did consider that and looked at ways we might actually accomplish that. Those that are in favor were suggesting that we get rid of the requirement of proceeding without a PPA criteria and use other criteria potentially related to a project state of readiness to determine if it would be eligible or not for this revised group 3. And under this framework, group 3 would really be open to all projects without a PPA. And we felt that you would really have to have an elaborate scoring system that would be needed to be able to rank the projects to determine, are they going to be really eligible for this grouping of group 3 that are proceeding, that don't have a PPA or are shortlisted at this point in time. And we really felt that in the end that we concluded such an elaborate scoring process is really more appropriate within the procurement process rather than us trying to get into this in the allocation process. We are also concerned that without a restrictive eligibility criteria, all projects that are in that group, all remaining TPD, could be allocated within 1 or 2 cycles. And then all transmission plan deliverability would be tied up until those or for that period of time while those projects are seeking a PPA until such time that they determine, okay, we're finally going to withdraw, or we have some other retention criteria that we have to utilize to remove their deliverability. So while we did strongly consider keeping Group 3 in a different mode, in the end, we decided it was best not to do that. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Okay, so moving on to our first caller. Caller, go ahead.
Hey there, this is Rayanne Quadra on behalf of EDF Renewables this morning. Thanks for your summary, Bob. I really appreciate the clarity that you presented the CAISO's proposal with. Right now, I'm having some concerns sort of about the ripple effects of the CAISO's decision to drop allocation Group 3, and I just kind of like to talk through what I see as like the impact on the solicitation market for PPAs outside of the ISO. Under this proposal, without Group 3 or some sort of substitute for Group 3 where a project can't get an allocation without being on a short list or having a PPA, we're effectually saying that LSEs need to identify, projects for a short list before those projects have an executed GIA, before the project has provided written notice to proceed, which means that PTO construction schedules and achievable commercial operation dates are very much in flux. And you can imagine that those commercial operation dates are really sensitive for those power purchase agreements. And in those situations, even if we were to bypass that information, the LSEs don't know for sure if the project they're selecting for their shortlist is going to get a TPD allocation, because it's not just about sort of reducing the number of eligible projects, but it's also about the amount of TPD that's available in a specific area. And so I'm wondering if the CAISO has any proposals or thoughts on how to sort of ease that transition, and rather than increasing the analysis burden for the LSEs.
Well, I guess I would start out by saying I don't really consider this a transition. Allocation Group 3 has always been intended for projects that would move forward without a PPA. And so, all of the discussion around the fact that, okay, by getting an allocation allows us to then seek a PPA is really outside of what Group 3 was really intended for. So we have had thoughts about how do we actually modify the allocation process in a manner to where, it would work out better potentially for the allocation, or excuse me, for the PPA process, where an LSE would know whether they've got a deliverability or not. But, outside of providing deliverability to everybody, or a very elaborate process of determining who is maybe the most ready projects that we would give an allocation to, that gets into a level of scrutinizing projects that, frankly, the ISO doesn't feel like we should be in that process of trying to do that and have the expertise of knowing exactly what every single permit might look like, and what's the readiness of projects in different situations and those type of things. So while we have considered it, and that's part of the reason that the original proposal that came out when we first brought out the issue paper of, well, maybe we ought to allocate transmission plan deliverability to the load serving entities, and then they could do the allocation and give it to a project they felt most appropriate to give it to. But that had a number of issues that we felt, and then stakeholders as well felt that it would be difficult to actually implement that type of process. So it basically brought us back to the process we have now, just refining it and kind of closing doors that were open that we think were not being utilized the way Group 3 is intended to be utilized, and not all projects were actually considered it appropriate to go into that allocation group, where others did, and it didn't seem like we actually had a level playing field with the current Group 3. So we have thought through it, and I think we'd still be open if someone had a really good idea of how to possibly restructure it. the TPD
Well,
allocation process.
Here's hoping you think this next idea is good then. I totally appreciate what the intent of the process was, but I think I also heard in your answer there that there's an acknowledgement of what, the actual process was in terms of how it was effectuated. And I think, it would be pretty disappointing for an LSE to shortlist or execute a PPA with a seller only to find out that there's no TPD available in that area. And so I'm suggesting that if you're moving forward with eliminating group 3, that there needs to be quite a bit more transparency into where TPD is potentially available, and that perhaps there's some sort of designation that could be made differently. Like maybe you don't allocate it to the project in terms of saying, it's yours now and you can hold it until you lose it. Maybe there's some sort of temporary designation or some sort of insight that the CAISO can provide to projects that have 100% of their site control or their major permitting in place, the CEQA, the CPCN, as they move forward. But, as difficult as it is for the CAISO to sort of pick winners and look at permitting, site control, and all these other factors that indicate that a project is viable, I'm not sure that LSEs are better situated to make those decisions independently of a more collaborative process. And while I don't think that the CAISO and LSEs should be discussing things confidentially, I think, in a push for more transparency, there's got to be some indication that a project potentially could get deliverability.
Well, we will talk about our commitment to move forward to try to provide more data to projects so that they can make more informed decisions. So we are committed to that process, to that transparency that you spoke of. For the remainder of your comments, I suggest provide those in your comments to this proposal.
I certainly will. And in my comments on the previous proposal, one of my asks was that before this dropping of allocation group 3 is codified in the tariff, if the CAISO could get general agreement from the stakeholder community that the planned transparency efforts are adequate to address some of those procedural challenges. So I hope you'll take that into consideration. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
All right, and moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I have a few questions here about several of the elements. The requirement that the PPA require deliverability and be with an off-taker that has an RA obligation. There has been some sort of offline discussions, and I think this was acceptable to the CAISO, but I didn't see it in the proposal, where if the off-taker does not have an RA obligation, but they have an arrangement to provide RA to an entity that does have such an obligation, that the CAISO would be willing to sort of connect those dots as long as it was a bona fide arrangement and, sort of looked just like an RA, contract you'd expect it to look. So, for example, a commercial industrial customer that might agree to provide RA or have an arrangement to provide RA to a CCA where it's located or something like that. Is that something the CAISO is still okay with?
Well, I think if you provide a specific proposal within your comments that we could consider, one of the components of the allocation process was that the TPD or the requirement for full capacity delivery status would have to be utilized for a minimum of 5 years.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something I'd like stakeholder input on. If they think 5 years is the right amount, I could see it going longer. I don't think I could see it going shorter. So if someone could demonstrate that they did have a firm contract for the RA for at least 5 years, I think that might be something that we'd at least consider. So feel free to provide that in your comments.
Okay, and I think we have, and we didn't get a specific response, but it would be good to know in advance whether the CAISO would, assuming that, again, that the obligation is a true obligation in the lines of a normal RA obligation that you would expect to see, that the CAISO would allow that. I mean, I think it's something that somebody actually does need to know up front instead of sort of, well, we might think about it. So it'd be good if you know, if it looks like an RA contract and it has all the things in it that an RA contract would have, and it has the term, which I'm going to ask about in a minute, it would be good to have some kind of explicit statement from the CAISO that they would consider that as an equivalent.
Well,
So,
obviously,
anyway.
I can't make a commitment to that on this call that we would definitely include that, but we definitely will consider it. And, you know, we just need to dock through all the pros and cons of something like that.
Okay. We'll put it in again. And then as far as the 5 years goes, that is a new element and hadn't really been discussed before. And today, you know, an RA contract is as little as a year, or potentially even less, but, you know, it would count. And so can you talk about how you picked 5 years, or why you felt the need to establish a minimum, or what sort of the rationale for that? It wasn't discussed too much in the proposal.
It's been something that has been asked as a question over the years from time to time, and we don't have any criteria. And one of the commenters did actually request that we did provide that. So we thought it was appropriate to do that. You know, while system RA is typically a 1-year contract, a local RA for 3 years, those are, you know, typically contracting just for the RA, not for the long-term PPAs that new projects are typically entering into. So we felt a minimum of 5 years would be appropriate. That if you're entering into these long-term contracts, you know, typically these contracts are longer than that, the PPAs that are being entered into. But we didn't want to necessarily cut it or make it too long. I'm sure be looking forward to hearing people's comments on that, what they think the appropriate time period would be. But we just kind of started off with thinking 5 years would kind of be kind of the minimum number we thought might be appropriate for such a requirement.
Okay, and I just wanted to say one other thing about Group 3. I know that Carrie talked about, you know, from the perspective of LSEs and how they don't necessarily, they have to sign contracts without knowing if the project has RA. I would say that question is actually even more acute from the perspective of the project, where a project, when they sign a PPA, then or put in a bid, you know, for a, you know, to be shortlisted or whatever, that once a contract is signed, usually they have to provide development security. They have to, you know, there's a real cost and a huge risk to signing something like that without knowing if the project has RA. And so I know the original intent of Group 3 was because you felt you had to offer an option for a project that was going without a PPA, but it has really evolved into more than that. It basically is a competitive advantage and a real security for the LSE and for the supplier to know that the project has an RA award before they are bid and before the project has to put up money. So I get what you're saying about you're not, you know, having everybody request this and then there's no deliverability left because, you know, all of cluster 14 or whatever just, you know, decides that they all want to do this and then there's nothing left. But I you know, I agree with Gridwell that maybe there are some fairly easy to determine screening criteria perhaps that could be developed. So if we have some ideas around that, we'll put that in the comments. But it is this idea of having to sign a contract or put up security and do things before you know is a really difficult one. And I think not only for the LSEs, but for the developers. Also, it basically, the structure with just the 3 that are here does put the control in the hands of the LSEs, even though I know you had sort of ruled that out as far as allowing them to do the allocation. If you have to have a contract or if you are shortlisted with an LSE, pretty much you have already put the hands of the screening into the hands of the LSE. So it sort of amounts to almost the same thing. So anyway, we'll put some more comments and some ideas about screening and things in our comments and hope you'll consider those.
Yeah, and the reality, you know, these requirements are not new. These have been in place. So, you know, I would tend to think that Group 2 would maybe not get you as far as you'd like to go, but at least to the point where an LSE can provide more than one project on their short list and then see which of those projects can actually get the actual allocation. So group 2 does somewhat lend itself for what you're requesting. And
I agree.
I guess I do want to make a comment on the fact that group 3 had evolved. It wasn't the ISO's intention that it evolved that way. And our concern is that it does give a project a competitive advantage if they get an allocation, when other projects may say, I'd like to go into the current group 3, but I'm just not willing to attest that I'm going to proceed without a PPA. So it doesn't seem like, again, that's a level playing field to continue it in that type of a format. So if we were going to continue or have a new group 3, it'd have to be open to everybody.
Well, I think you have
field.
said, as you pointed out, most projects will not build without a PPA anyway. And we don't disagree with that. It's just that Group 3 has allowed the project. There are more stringent requirements for Group 3. You can't delay your COD. You don't have suspension rights. There are more stringent rules around Group 3 that a project has to be willing to live with. Hopefully on the way to a PPA, which is what most of them use it for. But it has evolved that way, and we know it wasn't your intent to do that. But I think it's important to recognize the benefits of that to both the off-takers and the projects themselves for what it has evolved into. So sometimes things evolve and they change and they don't have their original purpose, but it doesn't mean that where they are now is a bad thing.
All right. Thanks, Susan.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Good morning. This is Songjie Zhu from Great Bright, representing California Wind Energy Association. We have a few comments and questions. First, CalWIA has the same position as Ryan and Susan just talked about. We have concerns about eliminating the current Group 3. So we'll put that into the written comments. And then next, regarding the 5 years for the PPA, our question is for resources with PPA shorter than 5 years, could they get interim deliverability?
Well, I'd have to think about it some more. So why don't you phrase that in your comments and we'll consider that.
Okay. Then the last question is about the ISP. You just said all the projects need to complete their deliverability assessment in the cluster process to participate. But for ISP, could they participate as energy only before they complete the deliverability assessment?
Yeah, that was the question that a stakeholder had brought up, which is that, once they complete all the reliability studies, but the deliverability studies typically take longer, and if those are not done yet, could they apply as an energy-only project, pay the $60,000, be studied, determine if they can move forward or not, because or not, they wouldn't trigger any DNUs. And our thinking was, well, that's allowing projects to kind of leapfrog over the projects that they're being studied for deliverability with, the current cluster that they're being studied with. There is an option that if a ISP does request energy only, they could come into Group 3 once they come online. But we really felt that it wasn't really appropriate for ISPs to be able to kind of get a head start on getting an allocation ahead of the group that they're being studied with. And frankly, I have a concern that if we allowed that, we'd see a whole lot of ISP projects come in where people were trying to utilize that mechanism to get an allocation sooner. So at this point, we don't think that's an appropriate process.
Okay, but just a few more points for you to consider. The ISP, you're concerned a lot of ISP projects, but actually the tariff only allows kind of one ISP project to be processed at a time in the study area. So even if you get a lot of requests, they won't get studied until it is a sequential process. One has to be completed before the next one will be tested for independence. So we just ask ISO to give more consideration to that, so ISP can participate, can seek TBD as energy only. So that can be even Group 1 or 2, right? Not just 3.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
This is Ryan here with Upstream. So I guess just circling back to the ISP thing again, I'd echo what GridBright just said, that in order to get into the ISP process, you have to pass the electrical independence test, showing that you're independent from everything else that's in the queue. So, allowing those projects to submit their TP affidavit earlier, I guess I just want to hear the concern of how that impacts other queued projects, because the ISP projects under the tariff have to be considered independent based on the electrical independence test.
Right. We're just concerned that, the fact that someone decides to claim ISP when someone else goes through the cluster process, where they may in reality really have the same timeline and process for moving forward. We don't have a lot of criteria to require an ISP project to demonstrate that they really need to move faster than the cluster study process would allow, which then opens the door for almost any project to be able to go through the ISP process. So our concern is that we'd either have to greatly tighten up the ISP process or just leave it as is. And what we're proposing is just leave it as is and have all of the all the projects that are being studied together for deliverability have the same timing to seek an allocation.
So I just add to that, I think we can all agree here, though, that the electrical independence test is already a pretty tight metric in order to get through that gate for EIT. I mean, I think if you look at all of the prior queued projects, I mean, I can't remember what queue number we're up to now, 2,000 or something like that. I mean, I think the number of ISP projects we've seen is probably single digits, right? So we already have that mechanism in place to act as a gatekeeper from people flooding the ISP process. That's why I'm just struggling with, kind of why are we calling that queue jumping?
Well, in essence, because projects, by putting in a interconnection request slightly before the interconnection window, they can get a jump on those other projects on the allocation. So that's where our thinking is.
And Bob, this is Steve Ruddy. The independence tests are only for reliability. It doesn't mean you're going to be able to deliver your energy at all. So that's why we have to do the deliverability study with the cluster.
So with the emergency interconnection process, how would those projects get interim deliverability?
And we're going to discuss that in a few minutes.
All right, I guess so. Moving on, the other thing I'd like to say, Bob.
Just to answer that question, though, we do have the process that if a project does come online prior to their deliverability studies being done, and that's something we put in for the summer of 2021, that a project can seek interim deliverability. So we do have that in the tariff and that mechanism for actually determining, can we give them interim deliverability or not.
Okay. So moving on from ISP, I guess we'd also echo what the other stakeholders have brought up about allocation group 3. Our concern is that by eliminating allocation group 3, we've effectively closed the door on any new merchant generation coming online. Because yes, they can still select allocation group 3, but the challenge is, these projects take 3 or 4 years to get online. So somebody makes that decision to go online merchant, they're really betting on the come that they're going to get deliverability after subsequent queue clusters have gone through that allocation process. So the concern is, really, what developer in the right mind is going to commit hundreds of millions of dollars to bring a project online, hoping that they can get deliverability from allocation group 3?
Well, I just go ahead and put that in your comments. From our perspective, I don't know that we've ever seen a true merchant project come online. Is that something that may see more in the future? I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, that's all we had.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Moving on to our next caller. Caller, go
Hi,
ahead.
Hi, yeah, great. Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the presentation and kind of sharing some of your thoughts. Would like to echo, I think I'll try to be short and sweet. I agree with the concerns that have been raised by the prior stakeholders. I emphasize what Rayanne said from Gridwell on her concerns. I know she framed them from an LSE perspective. We're coming from a developer and owner-operator perspective, but I see a lot of the same kind of risks on the commercial side of this type of change. And I believe we submitted these comments on the last iteration, but I just want to flag for folks who may not have seen them that we have some concerns that removing this, what this has evolved into, which is a process that I do believe, we leverage, we and others leverage for projects that are eventually going to seek a PPA, the allocation group 3. By removing that, we think that this will shift the analysis burden and commercial viability risk onto LSEs. We think that RFOs that would result in more shortlisted resources, which Group 2 provides that incentive for. So a longer short list of resources actually increases commercial costs and uncertainties in the market. We also think this gives an advantage to prior clusters. I think the last speaker was kind of alluding to some of that preferential concerns. We share those. We think that prior clusters that were able to receive TPD allocation as a result of Group 3 would have that TPD allocation and be looked at more favorably in the PPAs, where if you remove this option for projects seeking that in the clusters we're discussing, that puts the projects that are in these clusters at a disadvantage relative to those earlier clusters, which is of concern. And we also think that this can really increase risks of executed PPAs needing to be terminated. And this is really just a driver of if the incentives are out there to execute contracts because you need to do that in order to get the first cut on the TPD allocation, then commercial contracts will need to shift and probably commercial practices accordingly to potentially execute more contracts and then expect to terminate those that you didn't need or didn't receive the TPD allocation. Again, this injects a lot of uncertainty into the commercial space. Based on these concerns, we just are really worried this is going to have an adverse impact that CAISO is not intending, and that it won't expedite projects the way you're hoping for, and that it'll just make things more difficult to develop and add the additional generation that's needed for the procurement processes that we're striving towards as developers to better support near-term and mid-term reliability through adding new generation. And so we just wanted to flag these concerns and ask you to continue to develop this proposal, I think would be my request. If we could really use the scenario of a resource that does not have PPA executed and is not on the short list, that it is viable, it fully, has a sight line, a path to commercial operations, how we can accommodate it and meet the needs and concerns you're raising without harming those types of projects.
Okay. Well, we'll be looking forward to your full comments.
All right. Moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Hey, Bob, this is Brian Baker with Middle River Power. I'm a little confused by this discussion around the independent study process, and maybe I have a fundamental misunderstanding of what this is supposed to be. I went back to the slides from the last Interconnection Fair, and I'm going to just quote from them. First, the ISO says that it's advantageous for an independent study project to submit an application between November and March, but yet I hear the ISO expressing concern about that. And then in the description of what this process is supposed to be about, it says that demonstrate that the cluster process cannot accommodate the desired commercial operations date. And I'm just struggling to reconcile that with, the ISO's comment that being studied for deliverability as proposed by upstream would constitute queue jumping. Can you react to that?
Well, to the first part of your question, yeah, we do recommend projects that are seeking to go into the ISP to do it well ahead of the cluster study window, or the window for new interconnection requests. Quite often, the vast majority of projects we get into the ISP come in a month before, and they're not even fully validated as projects when the window opens. So we, really suggest doing that well advanced. So that's the reason for that. But we typically do see a lot of ISPs come in right before the window, trying to come in and beat that current cluster. So that's the concern. Related to the second part of your question, could you remind me what that is again?
The second point, maybe I fundamentally misunderstand what the purpose of the ISP is. I was reading from the slide. It says that an ISP project can demonstrate that the cluster process doesn't align with or accommodate the desired commercial operation date. And again, cluster 14 obviously has thrown a lot of stuff into a cocktail, but I'm just struggling to reconcile, the ISP with the ISO's position about seeking deliverability with as being queue jumping. Because right now, as you're well aware, the state is clamoring for, there's a lot of procurement orders out there. The state is clamoring for procurement, and it doesn't quite seem to align with that larger principle as well.
Well, kind of speaking to our experience, again, is getting a lot of projects just before the current, the next cluster window opens, projects trying to get ahead of those projects. But eventually what happens is the independence test can't be done until at a later date, so that the project ends up being studied with the current cluster for deliverability. So we're talking about projects that might come into the interconnection request window only a month ahead of all the other projects, and then have an opportunity, because they did choose ISP, to jump ahead of the projects that are being studied for deliverability with. So if you think about just the timing of those projects, if they're being studied with a cluster group, and if they could get deliverability sooner by going through the energy only study, we consider that potentially queue jumping, related to the fact that they have to demonstrate they need to come online sooner. That's right now a pretty soft set of demonstration that a project truly does need to go faster at this point. So I think there's a concern on our end that by allowing projects to get an allocation before their deliverability studies are done, it would open the door for projects to be able to say, well, I'm in that boat as well. Granted, I got to be proven independent, but, we may be flooded with ISPs and have to do a lot of independent studies, more than we're doing right now, which could put a bit of a burden on our process.
Okay, thanks, Bob, for elaborating on that in your comments. I appreciate it.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, this is Sam from SDG&E. Just wanted to check that WDAT energy-only projects that have achieved commercial operation that would have before been in allocation group 7 can still seek TPD through the affidavit process. I heard about something about them still needing to go through the study, but these would have been WDATs that state are already energy only and that later sought deliverability.
Yeah, so just to speak about both scenarios, one scenario is those energy-only projects that were never studied for deliverability, never requested full capacity delivery status. Those projects could come in any of these groups. And if they did select full capacity delivery status, being studied within the ISO cluster deliverability studies, those studies would have to be completed for them to seek an allocation.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm clear, so those WDATs that are energy only that never sought deliverability, that never went through the cluster study process, they would then need to go through the cluster study process, and wouldn't they be able to just get allocations via the affidavit?
Yes, they wouldn't have to go through the cluster study process, but they would have to provide an affidavit.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you very much.
All right, and we don't have any more questions in the queue.
All right, well, let's move to the next slide. So this topic is, should site exclusivity be required to progress into the phase 2 study process? And the vast majority of stakeholders were in agreement with requiring this, where site exclusivity would be required to go into phase 2. And then, so the majority discussion revolved around, should we actually implement this for cluster 14 phase 2 studies, or wait to implement it for cluster 15? And based on the majority, there was a vast majority that agreed with it, but also a smaller majority did agree that we should implement this for cluster 14 phase 2 studies. So that's what we are proposing. And we are also proposing that the document for site exclusivity would be due 10 business days prior to the interconnection financial security posting due date for each project. We feel that this will help mitigate the overheated queue and allow studies to focus on the most committed projects. The proposal provides more flexibility than what other ISOs and RTOs around the country typically require, which is site exclusivity with their interconnection request. And part of this process will be that we need to have, I think, a better definition, or at least we propose a definition for what site exclusivity would look like for offshore wind projects. So what we have in our proposal is language that I got from ISO New England on what they require for site exclusivity for wind projects. But we would like to have comments on that particular language and potential suggestions on how to make that language for site exclusivity for wind projects offshore more refined if it needs to be. It may be okay as it is, but if stakeholders feel that we need some further work, we definitely want to see your input on that. So with that, I'll open up for questions.
Okay, going to our first one. Caller, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a couple of quick questions. Can you explain the reason to have the site exclusivity requirement due 10 days before the posting date?
Well, that's something that's a bit of debatable. We came up with a date. We thought, well, if someone provided 10 business days in advance, we could review it and make sure that they have it. And if they don't have site exclusivity, then they might not have to go down the road of finalizing their IFS posting. 10 days would give us, if a project did not meet that, we would give them 5 days to cure, and then before being withdrawn. So that would put them just before the posting due date. So we thought, let's get that done before the posting due date is required, so that we're not trying to validate everything all at once.
Okay, so they provided 10 days before, and then you're going to take 5 days to validate, and then do the 5 days. I'm not quite sure I followed that. I'm sorry.
Well, we have, once the due date is passed, if someone has not provided site exclusivity, we would give them notice of withdrawal with 5 days to cure.
Okay, so you would be looking, so they give it to you 10 days, so you would, in terms of having it all processed before the posting was due, you would have to process it in less than 5 days and then give them the 5-day notice, and then they would, you would know before the post, in order to have that all done before the posting date, then that's kind of what you're thinking as far as timing?
Yeah, but we're thinking we're not going to consider the validation process within that time frame. Once we receive it, then we'll validate it. If there's problems, then we'll work with the project to overcome those issues. You know, either we're going to have received it or not by the due date. And at that point in time, if it's not received, then we'll provide that withdrawal notice with 5 days to cure.
Okay.
Within that time frame, we'll continue to validate.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So in requiring this, did you guys consider the fact that wind and solar projects, of course, have a lot larger bunches of land that they have to commit, and so that process may be a little more difficult for them to complete before phase 2?
Well, we basically are just going with what site exclusivity requirements are at this point, and we didn't think that we should get into different definitions for different projects other than for offshore wind, which is definitely a different aspect of what site exclusivity would look like.
Okay, and for offshore wind is presumably you're talking about leases and things like that, similar to onshore. When you looked at ISO New England and thought about what's happening on the West Coast, are you thinking it would be similar to onshore wind, or is there something else aside from leasing and things that would make it different?
Well, my understanding that, if I get this right, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management they have a process where they have an auction and provide leases and so forth, and the next auction will be coming up, as I understand it from them, sometime around this coming September, which would allow those offshore wind projects to tie up their lease prior to when this would be due.
Okay, so potentially if they were able to do that, they could meet the same. Sorry, go ahead, Sweet. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say,
be able to meet the timeline for cluster 14.
Okay, so you're thinking that that really might not need to have separate requirements for them, that they could just meet the same requirements as everyone else. It sounds
exactly. Right.
Okay.
And the only concern that I've got is it's my understanding that anything 3 miles and further out from the shoreline is under the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Anything within 3 miles is with the state of California. And do we need to have something, I don't know if any, I doubt that it's possible offshore wind could be within that 3 mile range, but do we need to have something that more specifically speaks to the process that the state of California would have? So those are kind of things that we're looking for input from stakeholders on.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the clarification.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Songzhe Great Bright. CalVia members provide some input regarding offshore. They suggest that there will be different requirement between the state waters and the federal waters because the process is different. The state water projects, they will obtain site control by submitting an application for a lease, and that application goes through the environmental review, and the lease is awarded upon approval of the EIR. So federal, you get a lease first, then get EIR, but for the state, they have to first get approval of the EIR, then they can get a lease. So there's some difference, and our members urge ISO to consider those differences.
Okay, so Sanja, I'd really be appreciative if you would provide what you think is the best route for those that are dealing with the state versus the federal, of what you think would be appropriate demonstration of site exclusivity going to a state process to go into phase 2.
Okay, yeah, we'll work with our members and see we can propose something.
All right, thank you.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Bob, this is Rayanne again. Could you just clarify whether the site exclusivity requirement for going into phase 2 is 50% like in the IR or 100% like in the commercial viability space? Thank you.
Well, it's in the paper itself. It's based on Appendix A definition. And I'd have to go back and look at it to remember exactly what it was. I was thinking it was 100%, but I'd have to double check that. Linda, you may be able to speak to that.
Yeah, site exclusivity is 50% of the land required for the project.
Thank you so much.
All right, moving on to our next caller. And caller, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. I just wanted to clarify, in all of these changes, will they apply to projects that are in clusters that are before cluster 14, or is this just cluster 14 and beyond?
Yeah, other clusters have already started or completed their phase 2 study, so it's past the due date for them. So this will start with cluster 14 and all subsequent clusters after cluster 14.
But in terms of the allocation, would the 5-year PPA apply to those projects if they haven't gotten allocation yet, or is that again only for cluster 14 and beyond?
Oh, okay, so you're talking about an allocation. I thought you were talking about site exclusivity.
Oh, no. Just in general, all of the changes and specifically the 5-year.
So within the changes for the allocation process, we are proposing to put those in place for the allocation cycle starting roughly next December 1st of 2022. It wouldn't impact projects that already have an allocation.
What about retention? If you get an allocation in, of March of this year, and you have the 1 year to get the retention and you execute a 3-year agreement, would you be able to retain it in December?
I would think that's something I think I haven't considered, but I think we should. So make sure that you put that in your comments.
Okay, thank you.
All right, looks like we don't have any more questions. Oh, we do have one caller. Okay, caller, go ahead. All right, looks like we don't have any more questions.
Okay, so the next slide is this you, Daniel?
Nope, I think it's Steve, me.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
All right. So in the original preliminary issue paper last September, the ISO sought stakeholder input on whether a new accelerated interconnection process should be considered for projects that can demonstrate an advanced readiness that would allow them to quickly go into operation relative to other projects. As you recall, overall, stakeholders were very reluctant to adopt such a measure that would enable earlier queued projects being leapfrogged. Therefore, the ISO did not recommend a proposal for long-term access to be based on that approach. So in the issue paper and straw proposal that we issued in December, the ISO noted that it believes it should still work with stakeholders to develop a framework for urgent reliability-driven interconnection service for interim interconnections. Such interconnections would resemble the emergency generation put in place this last summer in response to the governor's proclamation. The ISO proposed an expedited process to the extent a potential capacity shortfall is determined by the ISO that requires a proclamation from a governor, and then a state agency would need to determine the generators required to meet that shortfall. The ISO would then work with the applicable PTO, the state agency, and generator to expedite the interconnection process. So stakeholders did show significant support for this proposal as long as it was clearly defined, is only used under an emergency authorization, and must avoid queue jumping. Stakeholders also suggested or questioned whether interim deliverability could be provided to these units. So in the revised straw proposal, you'll see the ISO proposed the following for the emergency generation process. 1, the ISO will accept emergency generation study requests only pursuant to specific emergency state mandate and only for interconnections and additions specifically designated by a state agency, but not including counties, municipalities, or CCAs. 2, the ISO must agree the interconnection is warranted to potentially maintain reliability and that the interconnection will mitigate reliability risks. 3, the interconnection customer will submit an emergency generation study request a $50,000 study deposit, and all necessary technical information to assess the new generation. 4, because the ISO anticipates these studies and interconnections will be rapid, the ISO does not propose to include any study timelines in the tariff. The 5th one is the interconnection cannot negatively impact the cost for timing of any queued project unless the impacted project belongs to the same developer and the developer consents to the impact. 6, the interconnection cannot require network upgrades above 1 million or that cannot be constructed in fewer than 6 months. 7, the installed generation will have interconnection service for no more than 3 years. For interconnection service beyond that period, the developer must obtain service through another tariff process, such as in a new interconnection request. Finally, 8, during the 3-year period, the generation will be ineligible for any deliverability except interim deliverability consistent with Section 4.6 of the GET Act. And that is our proposal for the emergency process. So hopefully this answered a lot of the questions about when it can be used, how it's to be used, and whether deliverability can be applied to these projects. So with that, I'll go to questions.
All right, going on to our first one. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, this is Sam with SDG&E again. Thanks for the level of detail here, and definitely helps in, kind of thinking about what this might look like. One of the first ones is on the, mitigating reliability risks. And I think that, I know that we're going to have to work closely together between PTOs and the ISO and coming up with what are we actually looking at here in terms of reliability risks. This is very different than our typical study process where we're looking at, reliability issues like contingency overloads, that we're looking at near-term reliability, things like, lack of resources. So just some thoughts there. Just want to clarify, too, that the technical information that will be required for this and the subsequent study is really going to look like, a normal interconnection request, that we're going to need a full IR package from any potential ICs for this. And, the statement of it being rapid makes sense, and that we would handle this differently, like maybe like an ISP or something, but that we still are going to have to prepare the study, do the cost estimates, put reports together for these. So I see that there is no study timeline for it, but, just making sure that, everyone is aware of the time that it does take on the PTO side to, prepare this information. A question for ISO on the network upgrades above $1 million or constructed in less than 6 months. I guess I'm just having trouble trying to understand what kind of network upgrades you foresee that fall into this category. We'd see a RAS that might be less than $1 million, but with the requirements to get approval through the RAS-RS and others, then even a RAS, which is probably about the cheapest upgrade that we have on the network side, that's going to be more than 6 months. And then for IR&Us, for anything, at least in our system, that's over the 69 kV, we're looking at, a double breaker and a half scheme that's, always going to be more than $1 million, and that would be considered a network upgrade. So maybe I'll pause and see if we can get some feedback on that kind of network upgrade cost and time to construct.
Oh, those are all great points. I'll kind of start with, I think, how you started this with I'm kind of going blanket. Your very, very first question. Could you repeat the very first part of it?
Yeah, on the Are you talking about the network upgrades or back to the reliability assessment?
Okay, yeah, reliability. Thanks for triggering that for me. Yeah, no, if it's we don't expect that we would lower or reduce any reliability requirements that we already have in place. So they would have to meet the reliability requirements that we currently have. Secondly, your points about costs above $1 million and it would take longer than 6 months, those would not be good projects for this. These are ones that can come in, very quick response, get connected like we had this last summer under extreme emergency conditions. That's what we're looking for.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe something like a Gentai share, or something that really doesn't require any actual physical upgrades.
Right.
Okay. Okay. And then the last one is just on that, that 3 years of interconnection service. Is ISO considering that these customers would then submit applications to be studied in the next cluster so that we don't have these resources out there and not then ready after those 3-year period to become, continue to be a resource?
Exactly. Right. If they want to continue as a resource, they would have to enter one of the other interconnection processes that we have.
Perfect. Great. Thank you very much. That's all my comments.
Sure. Thanks for the questions.
All right, moving on to our next caller in queue. Caller, go ahead.
Sandra Zhu Graybright. First question is about the requirement network upgrade cost. This seems to give some advantage to the distribution connected generators because then all their triggered upgrades are actually distribution upgrade, very likely. So they can pass this criteria easier than the transmission connected. So would you consider to include the distribution upgrades in this cost threshold? And second one is about the study coordination between this and the regular queue study. So how do you determine the negative impact on the cost or timing of the queued projects?
Well, for your first question, the distribution would be connected under a WDAT process, not under our tariffs. So they would have to go to the PTO to get connected. And the PTO would have to create some kind of parallel system. I imagine if we're going to offer interim deliverability, we'll have to get involved with that. But we wouldn't be involved with the distribution connected project. The second part of your question about the impacts to other projects, we'll have to, we have ways to do that today, and we'll just have to analyze it and look at what's queued and see if we think it's going to impact them. I know that's a very generic answer, but these are extreme conditions where this would even be put in place. Hopefully we never have to use it, but we want it in place in case we do, like we did last summer.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I don't have any more callers in queue.
All right, thank you. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? All right. So in the December issue paper and straw proposal, the ISO proposed to increase fees to submit interconnection requests. The ISO proposed that the first 2 projects submitted by a parent company or entity, the study deposit would be $250,000 per request. For projects 3 to 5, the study deposit would be $500,000. And for more than 5 projects, the study deposit would be $1 million per request. The same percentages would be at risk as currently defined in the tariff. And then the ISO also proposed to increase the site exclusivity deposit requirements to $250,000 for small generators and $500,000 for large. And if a project withdraws after the interconnection request is deemed complete, 50% of the in lieu site exclusivity deposit would become non-refundable. Now, stakeholders were generally supportive of the higher fees, but there were some opposed to certain aspects of the ISO's proposal, such as the tiered scaling or timing of when deposits became non-refundable. And stakeholders also requested clarity on how the ISO would enforce or identify the number of IRs per parent company and how it would apply to complex project ownership, such as joint ventures. Since this is a phase 2 topic, the ISO did not put in any further updates to the proposal in this most recent paper, and will include it in the revised proposal and I'll have to talk to Danielle more about this, whether we actually put it in the next paper for consideration or wait till the June timing, but it will be forthcoming. So also in the December 6th issue paper and straw proposal, the ISO sought stakeholder feedback on the ways interconnection process and procurement activity could better align with transmission system capabilities and renewable generation portfolios developed for planning purposes, and specifically on two concepts. One concept was of not only developing transmission capacity for planning purposes associated with achieving specific resource development, and two, as a further step, withholding that capacity specifically for the policy-driven processes for which it was planned, rather than relying on it for any and all interconnection requests received through the request windows. The ISO also sought stakeholder input on if a solicitation model should be considered for some key locations and constraints not addressed in the portfolio development, where commercial interest is the primary driver, and specifically on two alternative concepts. One, a solicitation model to clarify in an overheated area which projects should proceed into the interconnection process, and two, a solicitation model to assess interest in area in which transmission capacity may be expanded in the planning process with commitments from the resources helping support the transmission development. So for these two topics, stakeholder input was supportive of continuing and having further conversations on these concepts, but no specific proposals for IPE were emerging. Nothing that the ISO felt we could take forward as a proposal. Many stakeholders even suggested that a broader participation is needed for these discussions. Therefore, the ISO will not advance a specific proposal at this time, but will seek further stakeholder input on these concepts in a separate stakeholder working groups. But to clarify an earlier question, we are not proposing that these conversations coexist with the IPE. They're going to be separate at this point, and will have their own timing and process. We believe the conversations most likely will not involve a tremendous amount of tariff updates, but will require a lot of coordination with other state agencies and so forth. So that is what the ISO is planning to do on these, and at this point I can take questions.
All right, so moving on to our first one. Caller, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, excuse me, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. So these are not phase two, these are previous phase two items, and so when do you think, what do you think the timing will be for initiating this separate process?
Well, we're going to have to internally discuss that, but it will be in parallel with most likely the phase two process, or maybe even start a little sooner.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on to, oh, okay, looks like we don't have any more callers.
All right. I'm not sure who's up.
Okay, this is Bob. So if we could move to the next slide. So the next number of slides are related to other residual issues that the ISO originally proposed, most of which are going to be moving forward in IPH Phase 1. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So this topic is the error omissions process to provide criteria and options when changes to network upgrade requirements occur after interconnection financial security postings have been made. So our proposal is only slightly changed from the original proposal, where we're proposing that any cost responsibility increases associated with an error omission on the part of the PTO that is discovered after the project due date for the second interconnection financial security posting would be the responsibility of PTO. This is really the crux of this issue, that this has been the ISO policies, the way we've been treating errors of omission that have been discovered after the second posting has been made, but it really hasn't been explicit in the tariff. People have been trying to utilize the existing error or omission process to deal with these issues, but the existing process as written for errors and omission comes to an end once postings are made. It's really related to what do you do, related to what kind of a revised study report should come out, and should a project's posting be allowed to have more time to make their posting or not. So once a posting is made, the tariff really doesn't speak to this issue. So this is what we are proposing. Projects would have the option to accept and move forward with the changes or withdraw when an error or omission is discovered after the project has made either its first or second IFS posting. So what we're proposing here is if a certain threshold has been met, the project could actually withdraw and get 100% of its financial security postings that has been made in any unused study deposits that have been made. And we're proposing that the criteria to receive this option to withdraw and get your posting back is a 10% increase. That increases the aggregate of all costs for the project to interconnect, or a minimum of 12-month delay in the earliest achievable in-service date for the project, or completion of the required DNUs. That last component is something that stakeholders suggested in their comments, and we have added to this proposal that we are also not only going to look for a 12-month delay in the in-service date, but also if the DNUs, the in-service date for the DNUs moves out by 12 months or more, that a project would qualify for withdrawal to receive its posting back. And we are seeking stakeholder feedback on including another item that was brought up by stakeholders, which is the termination of a project's PPA. That if an error or omission results in the termination of a PPA, that a project would be able to also qualify for this treatment where they could get their interconnection financial security back. So on this one, we are seeking stakeholder input on whether stakeholders support adding this to the threshold criteria. And we would be looking for specific eligibility criteria and appropriate documentation for that criteria. The ISO believes that this proposal balances the low probability of a detrimental error omission with the high impact that such an error omission can impose on interconnection customers and potential off-takers. So at this point, I'll open it for questions.
All right, moving on to our first caller. Caller, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you so much. This is Rayanne Quadra on behalf of EDF Renewables again. I did provide this feedback in the EDF comments, but I wondered if you could speak to it today, Bob. It seems to me, first off, that this is a really great proposal. I think the development community will be well served by it, and it represents a fair balance. Specifically regarding the criteria where the refund is issued, if there's a 12-month delay to the earliest achievable ISD or the completion of required DNUs, I'm wondering if the CAISO is open to adding an additional item there, such that if the project's COD as needed by their executed PPA is compromised, there can be, significant penalties on the interconnection customer side for failure to meet COD. And so I think that should be taken into consideration in terms of how the PTO's construction timeline has impacted the interconnection customer circumstance. And I'm not sure that 12 months is a short enough timeline for that consideration.
Yeah, I remember that comment, and we did discuss it. It got into an area that we weren't real comfortable in providing additional criteria for this treatment for getting your posting back. Within the PPA, there is always an opportunity to potentially renegotiate based on new study results that come out, and it was something that the ISO thought, well, it could come up in a number of different ways, and it's hard to actually come up with criteria that would be black and white under those conditions. So we did not include that. If other stakeholders feel that that's something that's appropriate, and if could come up with a proposal of what that would actually look like, we would consider it.
Thank you. I'll repeat my proposal and maybe put some more meat on the bones in the next turn. It just seems to me that the whole point philosophically of this effort is to make sure that the interconnection customer is not unduly harmed when an error, omission, or delay is no fault of their own. And in this situation, you know, the idea that you could just reopen up a PPA and renegotiate it if the dates are delayed puts, you know, the LSE at quite an advantage in that negotiation, and the interconnection customer's hands are tied. I'm not sure that that's, you know, really helping the interconnection customer that much if they're not given sort of this alternative out where the CAISO could give one. So I'll elaborate on that in comments, and I thank you for your time. Okay, and you know, just to be clear on this item that we're seeking input on terminating the PPA, if the interconnection customer thought that the impact of this were untenable to them and they chose to terminate the PPA, you know, that could meet the criteria. Now, I'm sure that's not the outcome that you would like to see, but I'd like to hear people's comments on that as well, of whether the IC can terminate its PPA due to these impacts. So it would open the door a little bit. In terms of termination clauses, liquidated damages, and all that, I wouldn't say that there's a real standard approach there, especially in the environment now where there's more than just the 3 big IOUs that are executing PPAs. So again, I'll provide details in the comments.
Thank you.
All right, and we don't have any more questions.
Okay, the next group of slides are over to Linda.
Okay, great. This next item is the RAS definition as an RNU. So the ISO is not making any changes to the original proposal that a RAS is always considered an RNU, whether it is identified in the reliability or deliverability portion of the study. There was overall support from the stakeholders on this item, and the RNU will continue to be included in the RNU cost allocation and eligible for cash reimbursement. There was a comment associated with the timing of participation in a RAS, which was not related to the definition of a RAS as an RNU. Any questions?
All right, looks like we don't have any callers in queue.
All right, then we can move on to the next. So this one regarding transferring PTO WDAT projects into the ISO queue. So all stakeholder comments were in support of this initiative to develop tariff language around accepting interconnection request transfers from a PTO's queue to the ISO's queue. So this item remains unchanged. This type of exchange has taken place in the past, but we're just going to be putting some tariff to it. Criteria will be developed between the PTOs and the ISO, and most importantly, including the timing around when this type of transfer can occur. The PTOs have to decide if they will include a reciprocal process for IR transfers from the ISO's queue to the PTO's queue. The comments did include a request for public information regarding the operational control of substations and lines to lessen the need for this type of process where a customer may apply to the wrong entity because they don't understand where their request needs to go. And I know there is another item on the list today about more clarity of information that is publicly available to our customers. And I guess that would be a good place to discuss that in addition to here. So, are there any questions about this?
All right, looks like we do have a question. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, this is Sam from SDG&E. So sorry, is there going to be some sort of a process that we're going to go through to determine, what these different, criteria are for doing this transfer, and kind of how that's going to look logistically between managing our WDAC queues and between what then potentially the ISO is going to be managing?
Absolutely. The ISO will work closely with the PTOs to determine the process.
Okay, and with this being part of the phase one, is that something that we're going to have outside of the IPE process for that?
Well, definitely be a discussion in support of the IPE process. So yeah, it would be away from this stakeholder process. We'd have to discuss it offline and get those decisions made and determine what those actual items will be that we'll have to meet in order to make this transfer.
Sure, yeah. It seems mostly like a logistics thing that we need to work through. So, okay, thank you.
Right, and yeah, no problem. Thanks, Sam.
And this is Bob. I just want to kind of clarify to those that may not fully understand kind of the issues with PTOs is that each PTO has a different window time frame for their WDAP projects, and we need to make sure that whatever we put into place is appropriate and doesn't open up any doors for someone to game the process by saying, well, I missed the ISO window, but I still got an opportunity to go into the WDAP process, and then it'll be discovered it's on the ISO, so it gets switched over. So we need to work through those kind of a little bit more sticky issues in this process, and so we'll have to work with the PTOs to develop the specific language around that issue.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I didn't have a question on this until I heard the last question. So are you saying that the tariff language here is not going to be part of the IPE? It's going to be some separate thing, and what process would that be? And will stakeholders have access to, comment opportunities, or what are you, anyway, my first question is this still part of the IPE, or is this going to be some separate thing?
No, it's part of the near-term enhancements in IPE.
Okay, so we will see the tariff language in the IPE and have the opportunity to comment on it as part of this initiative.
That is the intent, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification.
All right, it looks like we don't have any more questions.
All right, so next slide then, please. All right, all stakeholder comments received were in support of a project confirming its POI within 5 business days of the scoping meeting, and that any changes in the POI in this 5-day period would be limited to something within the same transmission study area as the originally requested POI. Project site changes in the 5 business days following the scoping meeting would only be allowed in conjunction with a permissible change of POI. Stakeholders did again request that these transmission study areas be publicly available, which can be a part of our ongoing discussion of how we can accomplish that, or if we can accomplish that. Any questions about this proposal?
Looks like we do have one. Caller, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a clarification, because this has been a little confusing to me in the way this is worded. The site changes, sometimes there are site adjustments that are made, not to wholesale site changes like moving from one whole place to another whole POI or anything, but sometimes there are site changes that are site adjustments that are made when, in the process of leasing and putting sites together for a project. There's no restriction here on any of that, is there?
This specifically, Susan, is addressing that 5 business days following the scoping meeting. I know that, and Debbie can confirm that the POI and site changes can be addressed via MMA following the phase 2 study process.
That's correct.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification.
So this is just specifically, just at the very beginning of the process.
Okay, so there's that third bullet point is kind of a sub bullet point of the rest here. So. Just
right, it's all, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, just the 5 business days following the scoping meeting. It's very compact right there. It's not overarching.
Okay, it would be good to clarify that going forward, but that's I really appreciate you doing that here. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
This is Sam from SDG&E again. Just a comment on this is that, we do our scoping meetings not too long before we close the all IRs have to be valid, and doing these POI changes at that time does require us to go through basically a whole brand new IR validation. Oftentimes, maybe the technology proposed by the IC is not going to change, but it does make it very tight for us to change these POIs. So I know that scoping meetings happen during a certain time. I know this is when we communicate about POI, bay position availability, but I don't know if there's going to be more discussion around this. I'm not putting forth any solution here, but it's just something that will be something that we can work together on figuring out how we can maybe communicate that information earlier to the ICs, just to not have such a small window between the scoping meeting, 5 days, POI change, and then having to have those IRs valid. During cluster 14, we had a number of changes because of POIs not being available, and it just put us in a big rush right there at the end of that IR window. So I don't know if any adjustments to that window for a POI change because of bay position unavailability, but just wanted to put forth some comments there.
Yeah, yes, Sam, I agree. Cluster 14 was difficult on a lot of fronts, and that would be one of them. So we can certainly bring that up during the discussion, but right now we're sticking to that 5 business days is what's in the tariff. We weren't proposing changing that, but if we need to discuss that, you can put comments around that.
Thanks.
Yeah, Sam, this is Bob Emmert. If you have some specific ideas related to that, the more specific you could be, the better of what you think might be an alternative way of dealing with that.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. We'll think about it and see if we can put something into comments.
Thanks, Sam.
All right. I don't have any more questions in queue.
All right. Next slide, please. So this is Deb Levine, and the question is, should park projects be allowed to submit MMAs while parked? And the responses that we got back were, yes, they should be allowed to submit an MMA, but not for anything and everything. So we liked that proposal. And so what we're proposing in the revised draw proposal is to allow only fuel type changes, technology changes, which in essence are wind to storage, solar to wind, et cetera, and POI changes. So I don't think that a project would have to change its inverters, its transformers, its phasing, any of those types of things as while they are parked. I think all of that can be done once they're in the negotiation. So I'd really like to keep it to a really tight number of items that can be changed during the MMA. And we did keep in there, though, that the IC must make the second posting when submitting the MMA. And then a park project, when the allocated TPD is less than requested, or the project does not desire to accept the amount allocated, the project can park for up to 2 years before the project withdraws or moves forward. So with that, any comments or questions?
All right, going on to our first one.
Hi, Deb. Hi, Deb. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. There's a few changes that are allowed without an MMA request, like inverter changes that are where the electrical properties are the same and you're not increasing the number of inverters or changing it. Would those still be allowed during parking?
You're talking about the permissible technological advancement changes?
Not specifically, but there's a section in the BPM for generator management that talks about changes that are allowed without an MMA before you get into all the changes that are allowed with an MMA. And I remember specifically the inverter changes that are where the electrical characteristics are the same. And there are one or two other things that were listed there. And I'm just wondering if it doesn't require an MMA request, can that still be done during parking?
That could still be done during parking, yes.
Okay, and site adjustments or anything like that, which is sort of what we just talked about in one of the last questions. Would that be allowed, or is that something, another one of those things you think could just be done after they come out of parking?
They'd have to deal with that after they come out of parking.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. That's all I had.
Perfect.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, this is Sam from SDG&E. So related to changing dates, I know COD adjustments is a lot of what we see when we're getting our MMAs on a regular basis, and maybe that's not included in the parking consideration, but one thing that we see is that we have a large number of projects that are parked, and then the dates that those projects got from their phase 2 studies are what drive, the dates that are within RIMS and what dates that we have to use when we do our operational studies. But we know that these projects are parked, and if we do a calculation similar to what we do in the study process on what their earliest achievable dates are, those dates are impacted by the fact that these projects are parked. So is there any consideration ISO would have into making it a date adjustment, maybe when the decision for parking is made, such that we can have the dates properly reflected when we're doing these, year-by-year operational studies?
Sam, that's a really good point. I think that so what we're trying to address here is whether the interconnection customer can make modifications. The PTO has the ability to make modifications at any time. So would it be appropriate for the PTO, because the project's parked, they know it's not going to work, to push out the COD based on the knowledge that they have?
We can certainly make a calculation for that. I guess how would we then communicate that to? Would there be a report that's due to parking, then we're adjusting the earliest achievable dates?
No. So what ends up happening is that you notify the CAISO, and the CAISO will then send a letter to the interconnection customer that because you're parked, your project has been moved out X years.
Similar to like a PTO delay letter?
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, maybe something else we can discuss, but I maybe I see this not tightly related to exactly this proposal, so thanks.
Sam, this is Bob. I just was thinking if you think this might be appropriate to add to your comments, one option might be that if a project does not submit an allocation, an affidavit, that they could say, well, I intend to park, or maybe with their allocation choices, and move my COD back appropriately to this date, if that might be something we could accommodate through that process. So is that something you think you'd like to pursue? Go ahead and put that in your comments.
Sure. Yeah. So you're talking about that potentially as part of the affidavit or something around there. If they're not to submit affidavits, then they could do something like an IC delay to the COD because of parking the project.
Yeah, we do have an option, the process of selecting your option when you get an allocation or don't get an allocation. We could make part of that process that I choose to park and please delay my COD by 12 months, up to 12 months maximum or something like that.
Sure, yeah. Would you like the comments around this or as a separate additional item of consideration?
I think you could go ahead and embed it in this particular item.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Songje Zhu Graybright. Just want to confirm technology type change also include adding or removing battery. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. How about downsizing? Would downsizing be allowed?
No.
Okay, thank you.
All right, then moving on to our last caller. Caller, go ahead.
Susan. Yeah, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I thought that last exchange was interesting about the COD delays, but it seems like and having the customer have the option to do the COD delays seems to make a lot of sense. But having the PTO do it, I guess my question was, just because the project parts for a year doesn't necessarily mean that the COD would have to be delayed. I mean, it might often happen that way, but it wouldn't always necessarily be the case. So I'm just wondering, I think having the customer have the option makes sense. Having the PTO do that or the CAISOs decide, I think we'll probably be a little more uncomfortable with that. But the other option might be a good idea.
Okay, thank you. If you could include that in your comments, that'd be great.
Yep, will do.
All right, looks like we have another caller who joined. Caller, go ahead.
Hey, this is Sam, SDG&E. Just to respond to Suzanne's comment, I agree, Suzanne, that it's not always, and that's where it'd be good to have some, collaboration between the PTO and the IC, because you're right that sometimes we put dates out there, but again, it's dependent on that construction timeline, and it could be the ICs choose dates that are beyond, and that it isn't going to end up impacting. But what we more so see is that ICs are choosing the earliest achievable dates based on those study reports, and not usually picking dates out past that. So I think it certainly would be something that maybe the ICs would submit, and then, PTOs could confirm, in conjunction with the ISO. So thanks.
All right, and we don't have any more. Oh.
Actually, but Sam, in the instance that you originally brought up, you were suggesting, or the way I took it is that the interconnection customer has an early end date. The PTO knows since they're parked, they're delaying it, and that the construction timeline is still 24 months. So if they sit parked for 2 years, you obviously can't build it in a day.
Correct.
So I was trying to limit those COD changes, not COD changes that anybody wants to make.
Correct. And I think you're right. And like I said, we're typically seeing that is that the earliest dates are the dates chosen by the IC. I think I was just trying to clarify to Suzanne's point that that's not always the case. And that, if we were just wholesale saying, okay, it's going to be 12-month delay regardless, then that might not be appropriate, because there are instances where it isn't that we have construction timelines and that are giving that earliest achievable date if the IC has chosen a date past that. So I think that we're talking about the same thing.
Okay. All right, great. Operator, any other questions?
No more questions in queue.
All right, excellent, thank you. Next slide, please. So previous phase 2 items deferred proposal development until the next iteration. So this is just letting everyone know that we are going to go ahead, and these items are in phase 2 and will be addressed as part of phase 2. So in essence, the alternative cost allocation for network-driven local upgrades is going to be in phase 2. Generators interconnecting outside the ISO, the reimbursement for the RNUs that are in the ISO, and then lastly, the ability to terminate the GIA earlier than the 7-year period. So next slide, please. So based on other stakeholder suggestions, there were additional proposals that were put forward. Next slide, please.
Hey, Deb, this is Danielle. Yep. I think this might actually be a great time to break for lunch and give give folks an hour break, and then we can pick up on this slide when we come back at 1, if that's all right.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. I just hadn't looked at the clock at all. Thank you.
Of course.
I was on a roll.
Yes, you were.
So at this time, we'll go ahead and take a break. It's 12 o'clock, so we'll come back at 1 and start up with the issues that other people proposed. So thanks so much, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to the 2021 Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative meeting. My name is Elisandra Casillas, representing the Stakeholder Engagement Group here at the ISO, and I will be facilitating this meeting. Reminder, for questions, you can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx, or if you've joined via audio only, press pound 2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first. From here, I will now hand it over back to Deb Levine, Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management.
Thanks, Ellie. Appreciate that. Okay, so now going on to other stakeholder suggested proposals. Next slide, please. So the modification to commercial viability criteria. We went ahead and LSA raised a concern that the interconnection customers should not be harmed by something that the PTO does and have the commercial viability criteria apply to them. We completely agree with that and went ahead and incorporated that into the original thought process as we were talking online. And then there was a request for the definition of delay. So in the paper, the revised straw proposal, we started a draft of a definition for delay. And I would just caution everyone, part of the challenge is that, as an example, in the negotiations, if the interconnection customer is supposed to reply on Tuesday and doesn't reply on Tuesday and wait 3 months, that delay should be the interconnection customer's delay. If the interconnection customer replies on Tuesday, but the participating TO or the CAISO doesn't get back to the customer when the due date is the following Friday for a month, then that would be a PTO or a CAISO delay. So I just want to be very sure that we're willing to go ahead and adamantly, CVC is not supposed to apply when the PTO triggers the delay. But I don't really want to get into a he said, she said type thing on this. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to define what a delay is, because I'm concerned it's not going to help the situation. So standards continually change, technology changes. There are various reasons for delays. Completely agree with that. The customer should not be impacted by a delay that is done due to the participating TO, but I think that we need to be a little bit careful as far as defining delay in the BPM or anything else. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it up to questions on that subject.
All right. Taking on the first caller. Caller, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Deb. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. A couple things. First of all, I don't think I understand what you're talking about with a a bit of a he said, she said thing on the definition. I think our main intent in suggesting this was if there's a notice that an upgrade is delayed, and normally that would be that the upgrade is delayed beyond the time that that is stated inside the GIA. And if the customer is given the notice to proceed, and then there's a construction delay, that would be where the situation would apply, not so much, the back and forth notice or anything like that. That it would probably be it's supposed to be sort of a cut and dried thing. That if the PTO is required to give a notice of delay, which they normally would be if it's delayed beyond the GIA date, then that would be when this would be triggered. So that was sort of our intent here, and hopefully it does not require anything complex to determine. So
okay, perfect. That's what we were hoping it was.
Okay. And then this idea of standards changing, all that, I guess So the question is, if there's a PTO delay, but it's because of, the statement was a little confusing. So is the idea that if there's a PTO delay because something has changed in terms of the technology of the interconnection, or what's really that intended to communicate there?
So in the comments that we received on the straw proposal, Southern California Edison made the comment that we need to respect the standards that each one of the PTOs has. And there are continual changes to meet the evolving reliability needs.
Right.
Technology, NERC, and et cetera. So the ISO agrees with Edison on that.
Okay, well, that's, you know, I mean, obviously, if there's standards that apply to them, they have to meet them. And I don't think anyone, obviously, may not be happy if that, but if that triggers a delay, that still, we think, should be considered a PTO delay. Not that it's their fault. I mean, I don't think we're looking to point fingers or anything, but not that it's their fault, but because they do have to comply if there's a standard and that kind of thing, but that should not necessarily subject the interconnection customer to any additional requirements.
I would agree with that.
Okay, all right. Then I think we're on the same page. The statement by itself was a little confusing, and so if you could just clarify it just that a little bit more, that would really be helpful.
I think it's very clear in the revised straw proposal. Obviously, when you start to get a whole subject that is 3 pages onto one slide, it gets a little cryptic. So I should have been better at explaining it. So sorry about that.
No. And it's not a criticism of you on the slide. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So great.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next slide, please. So the next slide is proposing to revise the tariff language to expand the deliverability transfer options. Currently, the transfer options are, it needs to be at the same point of interconnection. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to go ahead and move that to the same substation and the same voltage level instead of the exact point of interconnection in the substation. And so in the revised proposal, I did include just some draft tariff language for section 8.9.9 of Appendix DD, and then a little minor modification on the definition of the point of interconnection. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions. Everybody, no one had any issues with us changing or expanding the deliverability transfer options. All right. Operator, if I could have the next slide, please. So the next idea was to use RIMS as the communication for all of the documents associated with the project, including deliverability allocations, financial security postings, MMA, the final documentation, repowering in limited operation, final documentation, and the ISO is in agreement with this. What we'll need to do is just go ahead and probably send out some correspondence to everyone to let them know that we're starting to upload the documents that we have into RIMS. But we can do all this offline, and it does not require a tariff change. So any questions or concerns on this? All right, operator, next slide. And this is not my slide, but I don't know who it goes to. I think this goes to Linda.
I've been talking with being on mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, this one is mine. So I guess they got jumbled up a little bit. Okay. So This item is to add a validation deadline of 70 calendar days following the issuance of the Phase 1 study report for the Appendix B to be validated. With no tariff deadline presently, this process is sometimes drawn out even to the start of the Phase 2 study, and it really puts engineers in a crunch. Comments received for adding due dates for curing the Appendix B deficiencies were almost all in support, and the proposal remains unchanged. Projects that are not valid in the 70 calendar days from when the Phase 1 report is issued would be deemed withdrawn with a 5 business day cure period. Two of the commenters suggested due dates based on the results meeting date rather than the report date. Results meetings are required to be held within 30 calendar days of the report being issued, which leaves a minimum of 40 calendar days for a project that has a late results meeting. So the ISO believes that the Phase 1 results meeting will continue to be held within the tariff requirements and that the single due date is sufficient. There is the Supercluster 14 has 90 calendar days to complete the results meeting, so a reasonable ultimate validation date would need to be determined for that special case. Are there any questions about this? All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Linda. This is Bob. This issue is the proposed requirements when an IR proposes to utilize a third-party owned gen-tie or substation. And originally, the prior proposal was that an interconnection request customer would have to demonstrate that they have an executed gen-tie or substation sharing agreement when they submit their interconnection request. This proposal has softened that a bit to where now we're proposing that to require with the interconnection request submittal a letter of intent between the non-PT owned or third-party gen-tie or substation owner and the project seeking to share the gen-tie or substation, where the letter must document the intent of the parties to negotiate the terms of the sharing agreement. And then for Phase 2, we're proposing to require an executed gen-tie sharing agreement to proceed into the Phase 2 studies. And we are proposing that the executed agreement would be due at the same time the interconnection financial security posting is due, the initial posting between Phase 1 and Phase 2. We intend to implement this starting with cluster 15. And as a component of this that came up, we realized that we need to deal with the MMA process as well, that if a gen-tie sharing agreement, or excuse me, arrangement is requested in conjunction with a request for a project modification, proposing to require and execute a gen-tie sharing agreement to proceed into the MMA process. And this would be implemented as soon as FERC approves this tariff language, assuming they do. So any questions on this?
All right, looks like we do have one caller in queue. Caller, go ahead.
I see. It's just a clarification. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting again. So when you said it says will be implemented with cluster 15, that means that the gen-tie sharing arrangement or the executed gen-tie sharing agreement to proceed into Phase 2 is not going to be applicable to cluster 14. It would be also be implemented with cluster 15.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, both of these components for an initial IR and to proceed into Phase 2 would begin with cluster 15. And if there are no more questions, let's go to the next slide. So this slide has some previous proposed Phase 2 items that we are deferring proposals development until the next iteration of the policy or addressing outside of the IP process. So the first one is the item that Edison brought up, where they thought we're seeking, and what we are seeking at this point is input for the continued discussion to inform a proposal on making it explicit that when an IC agrees to share GenSci, PTO interconnection facilities, or any related IRNUs across clusters, the shared facilities are not subject to the GitApp section 14.2.2, where the PTO is required to backstop the cost if the prior cluster project finds a GIA, then withdraws. They are proposing that the later clustered project that is sharing a component such as an IRNU would have cost responsibility for it rather than being backstopped by the PTO. In the paper, we provided some of the ISO's thinking on the topic, but at this point, we are seeking more stakeholder input to help us develop a proposal. So, we've got a lot of comments, but comments are kind of all over the place. If we can start to get some very focused ideas of what everybody thinks on this, that would be helpful for us to develop a proposal that we think we see enough stakeholder support for a particular direction. And then the next item is we have broad support for improving transmission grid data transparency, and we are proposing to host a separate stakeholder working group to get specifics on the data being requested, the format and the frequency of that data. And since this item, the outcome of this process will not require tariff changes or board approval, we propose to use the initiative to keep stakeholders informed, but the working groups to develop this data transparency process will really be performed outside of the I process. We'll just use the I process to continue to inform stakeholders of our progress on that. So any comments on this slide?
All right, looks like we do have a couple callers in queue. Moving on to our first one. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is Sam from SDG&E. Apologize, I'm having some issues with WebEx, but on the previous item on the requiring documentation for GenSci sharing, was there any reason why PISA didn't consider applying that to cluster 14 in order to go into phase 2, as opposed to starting it with 15?
Well, I don't think we had enough stakeholder support to require it for cluster 14. So we didn't propose that. If you think that we should bump up the requirements to start at 14, you can always include that in your comments. It's been something that we probably don't, we've got a few of these going on, possibly in cluster 14. I'm not really sure exactly the number, but we didn't think it was so critical that we had to necessarily get it started with cluster 14, but we think it is necessary to actually implement something like this. So we thought cluster 15 was soon enough.
Okay, great, thanks. And on the current slide regarding the IRNUs across clusters, I do appreciate the ISO's proposal on that. We'll certainly be submitting comments. One item that we'll submit comments on, but for consideration, is on the election for ICs to choose to build IRNU switch yards that qualify for SANU, and how that adjusts the third IFS posting, and then how that can, part of the qualifier in there was that if a project has submitted their third IFS, then the IRNU could be considered a PNU moving forward based on the proposal. But the only kind of caveat there is that that third IFS can be adjusted if the ICs are choosing to build that as a SANU switch yard. So something we'll put in comments on, but just another item of consideration there.
Okay, I appreciate that.
All right, and then moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. We had put in a suggestion for, I think we called it distinctions within clusters. That was what it was called in the last version, where we were asking for distinctions within interconnection studies and to let projects know when there's an RNU in particular, or a DNU, but particularly an RNU that was needed for interconnection, but not for the entire cluster. So there were some distinctions within the clusters that it turns out, for example, I think the recent circuit breaker issue that came up pretty late in the process in San Diego, it turns out that the cluster that triggered it, almost all the projects in the cluster could connect without that, but there was, sort of that information was not immediately available right away. And anyway, so we'll be seeking to put some of that information into interconnection studies, just to let people know how much of the cluster, given the trigger of that upgrade, how much of the cluster could possibly connect before that upgrade really was needed physically. And so I guess the couple things. First of all, I understand that's been sort of combined with the data transparency group. And so I was wondering what the timing was for that group, this working group.
I don't know that we've actually developed that much. I know Debbie has been more involved in it than I have. Debbie, can you provide any further clarification? I don't know if you're on, Debbie, but you're on mute.
But I'm having a wonderful discussion with myself.
I'm sure it's scintillating.
We haven't come up with a schedule yet. Obviously, sooner versus later is what we'd like to do, but it's finding time on calendars. So probably towards the end of February, early March is when we'd look to get everybody together and get some specifics as to what exactly people are looking for as far as data transparency is concerned, and then have a discussion about the format, its frequency, and et cetera. I think with the transmission providers now doing the quarterly reports on the transmission upgrades, that does give you some additional information, but we are looking to get more information out to you.
Okay, and because what we'd really like to see, because if you wait till limited operation study and it's 5 minutes before or 5 months, sorry, Freudian slip, before the initial sync, and then then it's 45 days later you actually get an answer, you're just too close to really have that be something you could depend on. So if there's any way to put this in the interconnection studies about, and not necessarily for a particular project, but how much, which parts of the project or which parts of the cluster might be able to connect earlier, if an RNU is in there like that, it's something that possibly, because you have a description in the tariff of what is in the phase 1 and phase 2 studies, it's possible that might require a tariff change, maybe, if that is added to the study. So I just wanted to put up a little bit of a red flag about, assuming it's going to be still on the same timeline as the other phase 1 items, that it could require, if that argument prevails, it could require potentially a tariff change.
Okay, we'll take a look at that.
Okay, thanks.
Can you check comments?
I will. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So that looks like all the questions. We can move to the next slide. So this slide contains 2 items that the ISO is proposing to remove from the initiative scope. And the first one is the network upgrade restacking proposal, where sequencing of network upgrade construction is performed by the PTO, and it's not something the ISO can really do. There are engineering considerations and queue jumping concerns with this, and these considerations are dynamic in nature and are best handled by the PTOs. So, there's not a whole lot the ISO can do other than just kind of watch over their shoulders. So we really believe this is something that the customer should be working with the PTOs on, and the ISO is proposing to remove this topic from the IPE. And the second item is re-examining the ISP electrical independence test. The ISO believes that modifying the current ISP EIT criteria could adversely impact the process as well as impact other projects adversely. And under the current criteria, projects connecting to a good location will pass the EIT. So at this point, the ISO is proposing to remove this topic from the IPE process. Are there any questions?
that, looks like we do have a couple. We're on to our first one. Caller, go ahead.
I'm sure you're not surprised by this. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I want to try one more time on the restacking. We're not proposing actually to change the timing of any network upgrades or change the cost responsibility of any network upgrades. So the issue was really, given the network upgrades that have been triggered and the timing that is already associated with them, and to see if, given the relative CODs of the projects, if some of the projects, say in a later cluster, could sort of use, in some sense, the upgrades that were triggered for an earlier cluster, if some of the projects in the earlier cluster had later CODs. So the idea was simply to reassign, only in sort of a physical interconnection sense, the upgrades to the projects, but not to change the cost allocation, not to change the sequencing or the timing of any of the network upgrades, just simply to look at the relative CODs of the projects and the relative in-service dates of the upgrades that were already on the board, and see if it's possible to give some projects, say, an earlier COD or earlier FCDS than otherwise. So that was really, we didn't really even know. I mean, it was just sort of a creative idea, and we didn't know if it would help or not. But it seemed like there was a possibility, at least, that it might help for projects that were at a later queue position but earlier COD, or projects had earlier queue positions but later CODs. If you could just match things that way without changing cost responsibility or scheduling or work scheduling, that might enable some projects to maybe to move ahead a little faster, or that kind of thing. So that was really the only intent to do this, not to impact the workflow in any way or the cost allocation.
Well, Debbie, I'm going to look to you and see if you have any comments on Susan's comment.
I don't. Sorry.
Bob, this is Binay from ISO. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing, that if the concern is, let's say, with the later QCOD, later cluster project with earlier COD, that is the intent of limited operational study, to make sure that they can come online if there is a capacity on the system.
Well, the problem
I think.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Go ahead. I think I'm done. I just wanted to say that limited operational study is.
Yeah. Well, there's two problems with that. One of them is that you can't sign a GIA, which would have an earlier COD than your particular assigned upgrade would indicate. So you can't. The project couldn't. An limited operation study doesn't address that at all. The limited operation study is just if if an RNU, for example, is not proceeding based on the dates in the GIA, then you can see if you can come online anyway. But it doesn't impact the idea that, or it doesn't give you the idea that you could have your earlier COD than what is indicated by your cluster upgrade timing, because you could possibly get something earlier if all the upgrades were considered together. The other thing is the limited operation study comes so late that a project, by the time they've gotten to 5 months before their initial sync, they've got to already be very far along in construction. So to wait till then to find out if they could come online, a year early, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think it's something really that has to be looked at up front, well before the limited operation study, and not really tied to that concept.
Yeah, I guess at this point, all we can ask for, if you can submit comment with a little more clarification what exactly we're trying to address. We were a little lost looking at this,
Okay, and we can talk about it offline too. We'd be happy to do that. But yeah, we'll try and put in a couple of simple examples to illustrate. But really, I just want to also just emphasize that we're not looking to reallocate costs or change work scheduling. So just to make that very clear. And we'll try and put in a couple of simple examples. Again, we're not 100% sure whether how effective this would even be, but it seemed like it might be an idea worth looking at, and I wanted to make sure at least that it was that the concept was understood. So we'll try and do better in the comments and see if that will help.
Yeah, Susan, this is Steve Ruddy. Question for you on this is, how would this be triggered? Would it be a customer would say, hey, I think I can come on early. Could you check this out for me? Because if it's left to the ISO, you're talking about infinite number of scenarios.
Oh, yeah, of course. Now, I think there's a couple different ways you could do it. You could basically say, okay, starting today, I'm going to look at all of the upgrades and all the projects and see if I could, see how that would work. Or maybe when you get done with the cluster study, you might do a restacking at that time for all of the projects, just the projects in the cluster, and see if they might be able to come online earlier than it would otherwise be indicated, something like that. So, we weren't looking at necessarily a, case by case, every single project asking. I think that obviously would be unwieldy for everybody. But maybe something that you might look at the end of the phase 2 study or something like that, to look at all the upgrades that were triggered, look at all the projects and the relative CODs and what the latest cluster was asking in terms of CODs, where you can't give them what they're asking, but maybe if you were to implement this concept, you might be able to restack at the end of, like I said, at the end of a phase 2 study or something like that.
Well, even under that scenario, it's still an infinite. We'd have to take each project and say, okay, can this one move earlier? Okay, if he can, what about the next one? Or what if the other one does that? I think it needs to be something that's requested by an interconnection customer.
Well, it could be requested maybe by the phase 2 study, and then for the ones that are requested, you might take a look at the restacking at that point and say, well, we can accommodate 2 of the 3 of you, and or something like that. I mean, again, it's a concept. I understand there'd be some implementation issues, but we were not necessarily looking at redoing everybody all the time or at any time they ask. So maybe for the next cluster, you might, again, you've got new clusters coming in, you've got all this procurement that has to happen. And if there's any chance you can move some projects ahead who wanted the earlier CODs, then maybe that might be a way to let them do that. So we had proposed this sort of under the rubric of, how to move ahead ready projects kind of thing. So, I mean, anyway, I'm not saying that we had all the answers to every single question here, and you're asking reasonable questions, but we'll try and do a better job of explaining the concept, and if it can be tweaked, if you could, modify it or do something with it. We're just thinking that maybe this might be a way to let some ready projects move ahead without her impairing any other projects or changing cost allocation or queue jumping or anything like that.
And Susan, this is Bob. Just kind of thinking in line with what Steve was thinking, was you learned a lot about those kind of issues at the scoping, or excuse me, the results meeting. So it might be something you might consider proposing, that within X number of days after the results meeting, that you would ask for more detail on, how this would play out under a specific scenario.
Okay. We'll do that. Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Okay, that's all I have.
All right, moving on to our next caller. Caller, go ahead.
Drew Great-Bright. We have 2 comments. The first one is regarding the limit operational study. Limit operation LOS study, although very helpful, we see a gap with the timing. So we submitted a comment in the last round. We suggest maybe make LOS as early as 24 months before the initial synchronization date. We understand ISO's position that 2 years ahead of the initial synchronization, that study still there's too much uncertainty. So that our recommendation on that is the developers do need some information to move forward and to develop the project. So 2 years ahead, even if it's non-binding, just some information that will be helpful to the developers. So right now, ISO already has the operational study in phase 2. So could ISO consider enhance that study, formalize that study, make the study more useful to the generators, at least show year by year what are the limitations based on the current COD in the queue, and then publish those results, make them available to the generators, and the particular generator then, based on that information, may request further study by ISO and the PTO. Such study, with the understanding that the findings from the studies are not binding, since they are still ahead of maybe a year or 2 years ahead of the actual synchronization date. That's first comment. Then the second one is regarding this ISP. We understand ISO's concern is there could be, so more projects will make use ISP that could be accumulating impacts. But actually the tariff as is already prevent that. First, there are all kinds of criteria for ISP, commercial criteria, then the independence criteria. And secondly, it's a sequential, so the ISO only process one at a time in the study area. And third, there's not just the individual EIT criteria, there's also aggregate flow test criteria in the tariff already. So that prevents many ISP on top of each other and create accumulated impacts. Those are our comments.
Well, I think at this, Benay or Robert, would you have any response to that?
This has been no, I don't have any comment on that right now. We do believe that, you know, it would create a you know, adverse impact to the process, and the current criteria, we believe it's sufficient. So we provided the reasoning. So any further detail, Songjay, if you could put that in your comment, we'll take a look at it.
Yeah, sure, we will. And we just ask you to take another look. You know, there are 8 stakeholders support this ISP change. It might worth ISO looking at it one more time. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions on this slide?
Looks like we don't have any more questions.
Okay, turn it back to you, Danielle.
Thanks, Bob. So as far as next steps, we can go ahead and move to the next slide. But first off, I want to thank everyone for attending today's meeting. I think the discussion is really helpful for the ISO, and we look forward to getting your comments back. Speaking of comments, the comment deadline is on February 15th, so about 2 weeks from now. And we'll be releasing a comments template later today, if not early tomorrow, for you to use to submit your comments and feedback. And then we're looking to publish the draft final proposal specific to phase 1 on March 10th. And I'll be working with the team internally to develop more of a plan and schedule for when those additional stakeholder workshops may be happening, and make sure to let stakeholders know when to expect those to occur. Move to the next slide. Yep, so like I mentioned, comments are due by the end of the day on February 15th on this revised draft proposal. And yes, are there any other questions or comments? Okay, hearing none. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ellie to close things out for today.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for a limited time after this meeting. We look forward to receiving your comments on the revised draft proposal by the end of day, February 15th, and have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.